Every Sunday morning in Minneapolis, two Lutheran churches wake up to dramatically different realities. At Faith Memorial, the organ plays to 73 souls scattered across a sanctuary built for 800. The average age is 68. The Sunday school rooms have been empty for 6 years. Meanwhile, across town at Resurrection Lutheran, three services are packed with over 2,000 people. Young families arrive early to get parking. Children sprint down hallways. The coffee always runs out by 10 a.m. Same denomination. Same city. Same theology, technically. But one church is planning its funeral while the other just broke ground on a third expansion in 15 years. This isn't a story about good versus evil or faithful versus unfaithful. It's far more complicated and far more fascinating than that. Because the answer to why one church is dying and another is surviving reveals something profound about how institutions evolve, how communities fracture, and how the smallest decisions made decades ago can seal a fate no one saw coming. Let me take you inside these two worlds. Faith Memorial Lutheran Church sits on the corner of Park Avenue and 34th Street, a magnificent Gothic structure completed in 1928. The sanctuary features hand-carved oak pews imported from Germany, stained glass windows that took craftsmen 4 years to install, and an organ that cost more than most houses when it was commissioned in 1952. The building alone is worth approximately $6 million. It's architecturally stunning. Walking inside feels like stepping into a European cathedral. But here's the thing about beautiful old buildings. They're expensive. Faith Memorial's annual maintenance budget is $340,000. That's just maintenance. Not programs, not salaries, not outreach. Just keeping the roof from leaking and the furnace running. With a congregation of 73 members, most of them retired or on fixed incomes, the math doesn't work. Every year they dip deeper into an endowment that's shrinking faster than anyone wants to admit. Welcome to Professor Archive. This is where we dig into the stories history forgot to tell you. Now, before we go further, I'm curious. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below because I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you're enjoying this kind of deep dive into overlooked history, a super thanks really helps us keep researching these forgotten narratives. But let's get back to our tale of two churches. Pastor Margaret Holmgren has led Faith Memorial for 11 years. She's 62, with kind eyes and an academic background that includes a doctorate in systematic theology. She writes thoughtful sermons that engage with contemporary philosophy and ancient church tradition. On paper, she's exactly what you'd want in a Lutheran pastor. But when I spoke with members of her congregation, something interesting emerged. Her sermons are wonderful, one member told me, speaking on condition of anonymity. Truly wonderful. But I couldn't tell you what last Sunday's was about. Something about Kierkegaard and authenticity, I think. Another member, an 81-year-old retired teacher named Dorothy, put it more bluntly. I come to church because I've been coming for 60 years. My parents were married here. My children were baptized here. But I'll be honest with you, I don't know anyone under 40. I don't even know anyone under 60 except Pastor Margaret. The Sunday I visited Faith Memorial, the service began at 10 a.m. sharp. The organ prelude was Bach's Wache auf, performed flawlessly by Gerald, the 75-year-old organist who's held the position for 43 years. 18 people sat in the sanctuary, 18, in a space designed for 800. The liturgy followed the precise order from the Lutheran Book of Worship, traditional rite. Every word was in the bulletin. Every response was printed. There were no surprises, no deviations, no spontaneity. The sermon, as promised, was intellectually rigorous, a meditation on the Book of Job that referenced René Girard, Jürgen Moltmann, and the problem of theodicy. It was the kind of sermon that would earn approving nods in a seminary classroom. But here's what struck me. Not once during the entire service did anyone smile. Not once did anyone speak to their neighbor, except during the designated sharing of the peace, which lasted exactly 90 seconds and consisted of formal handshakes. The whole thing felt less like a gathering and more like a ritual performed, because it had always been performed. After the service, there was coffee in the fellowship hall. 7 people attended. They stood in the same positions they apparently always stand, speaking in hushed voices about the weather and the declining state of everything. I was introduced as a visitor, received polite acknowledgement, and then the conversation continued as if I weren't there. No one asked my name. No one asked where I was from. No one invited me to anything. I left Faith Memorial understanding something important. This church isn't dying because people are bad or unfaithful. It's dying because it's become a museum. A beautiful, reverent, theologically sophisticated museum. But museums preserve the past. They don't create the future. Now, let me take you to Resurrection Lutheran. The church meets in a building that looks like it was designed by someone who'd never seen a traditional church and didn't care to. It's modern, angular, lots of glass and exposed steel. The main gathering space, they don't call it a sanctuary, is deliberately plain. Movable chairs instead of pews. Screens instead of hymnals. A stage instead of an altar. The aesthetic is coffee shop meets tech startup. And on the Sunday I visited, it was absolutely packed. I arrived at 8:45 for the 9 a.m. service. The parking lot was already 3/4 full. Volunteers in bright orange vests directed traffic. At the entrance, greeters actually greeted not just a mumbled good morning, but full eye contact, enthusiastic hellos, questions about whether I'd been before. Within 90 seconds, someone had offered to show me around, get me coffee, and introduce me to people in my stage of life. The demographic difference from Faith Memorial was staggering. Young families everywhere, teenagers in clusters, people in their 20s and 30s easily outnumbered the elderly. The dress code ranged from business casual to jeans and t-shirts. The noise level was what you'd expect from a room with 200 children running around. The service began not with an organ prelude, but with a rock band. Drums, electric guitars, a light show. The music was contemporary Christian, the kind you'd hear on Christian radio stations. Emotionally driven, repetitive lyrics, built for creating an experience rather than conveying complex theology. People raised their hands. Some closed their eyes and swayed. The volume was loud enough that you could feel it. Then came the sermon. Pastor Ryan Mitchell is 41. He wears jeans and untucked button-down shirts. His sermons are nothing like Pastor Margaret's. Where she references German theologians and wrestles with philosophical problems, Pastor Ryan tells stories. He uses humor, often self-deprecating. He talks about his marriage, his struggles as a father, his doubts and failures. The sermon I heard was about anxiety. He began with a story about his daughter's meltdown before a dance recital, pivoted to statistics about anxiety disorders in America, read a passage from Matthew about worry, and then spent 20 minutes giving practical advice. Techniques for managing stress. The importance of community. How faith intersects with mental health. It was accessible, relatable, immediately applicable. Was it intellectually rigorous? No. Would it pass muster in an academic theology department? Probably not. But did it connect with the room? Absolutely. People took notes. Heads nodded. When he cracked a joke about his own tendency to catastrophize, the whole room laughed. After the service, I counted 47 people who approached me to introduce themselves. 47! I was invited to 3 different small groups, a men's Bible study, a newcomer's lunch, and a volleyball league. Someone added my number to a group text. Someone else friended me on Facebook before I left the building. The contrast with Faith Memorial couldn't be more stark. And here's where the story gets really interesting, because what I've described so far might make you think this is simply a case of traditional versus contemporary, old versus new, theology versus therapy. But the reality is far more complex. Both of these churches are part of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the ELCA. Same denomination, same official theology, same liturgical tradition, theoretically. But somewhere along the way, they made radically different choices about what mattered most. To understand why, we need to go back. Not just a few years, but decades. Faith Memorial was founded in 1898 by German Lutheran immigrants. For its first 50 years, services were conducted entirely in German. The congregation was tight-knit, insular, centered around families who'd emigrated from the same regions of Germany. They built their magnificent sanctuary in 1928, during the height of their prosperity. At the time, membership exceeded 1,200. Throughout the mid-20th century, Faith Memorial represented establishment Lutheranism, the educated professional class. Doctors, lawyers, professors. The sermons engaged with the latest theological trends from Europe. When Rudolf Bultmann's demythologization program was causing controversy in academic circles, Faith Memorial's pastor was preaching about it. When the social gospel movement emerged, Faith Memorial sent substantial funds to urban missions. This was serious, intellectual, socially conscious Lutheranism, and it worked for a time. Through the 1960s, membership remained strong. The Sunday school had 300 children. The youth group went on mission trips. The church sponsored a refugee family from Hungary, then another from Vietnam. But then something changed. Or rather, several things changed simultaneously, and Faith Memorial failed to adapt to any of them. First, the neighborhood shifted. Minneapolis underwent significant demographic changes in the 1970s and 80s. White flight to the suburbs meant that the families who'd been the core of Faith Memorial moved 20 minutes away. They faced a choice: commute back for church or find something closer. Many chose the latter. Second, cultural attitudes toward institutions, especially religious institutions, began to shift. The assumption that educated, thoughtful people naturally participated in church evaporated. Church attendance became optional, then unusual, then vaguely suspect among the professional class that Faith Memorial had always courted. Third, and this is crucial, Faith Memorial doubled down on exactly the things that were becoming less appealing to the broader culture. As society became more casual, Faith Memorial became more formal. As people craved authenticity and vulnerability, Faith Memorial prized theological sophistication and emotional restraint. As the culture fragmented into niche communities, Faith Memorial insisted on a broad, intellectually demanding approach that required significant background knowledge to fully appreciate. They didn't do this out of stubbornness or spite. They did it because they genuinely believed that serious, thoughtful, theologically rich Christianity was what the world needed. They believed that dumbing things down or making church too accessible would compromise the integrity of the faith. And you know what? They weren't entirely wrong. There is something valuable about theological depth, about engaging with 2,000 years of Christian thought, about not reducing everything to simple slogans and emotional experiences. But here's the tragedy. In trying to preserve theological integrity, they lost the ability to transmit that theology to new generations. Because theology, no matter how rich and true, has to be communicated. It has to connect. It has to make sense in someone's actual life. Meanwhile, Resurrection Lutheran took a completely different path. The church was founded in 1997, which means it's barely a quarter century old. It began when a group of about 30 people, frustrated with what they saw as the decline of traditional Lutheran churches, decided to start fresh. They didn't have a building. They met in a middle school cafeteria. They didn't have an organ or hand-carved pews or stained glass. They had folding chairs and a pastor with a guitar. But they had something else, a clear vision of what they were trying to accomplish. Pastor Ryan puts it this way: we asked ourselves a simple question. If someone who's never been to church, who's curious about faith but has no religious background, walked into our service on Sunday, would they understand what was happening? Would they feel welcome? Would anything we said or did make sense in their actual life? That question drove every decision. Music had to be accessible, so they used contemporary styles that people already listened to. Sermons had to connect with real life, so they focused on practical application. The building had to be inviting, so they designed it to feel like a coffee shop, not a cathedral. Community had to be intentional, so they built elaborate systems of small groups, welcoming teams, and follow-up processes. In other words, Resurrection engineered themselves for growth. They studied what worked in successful churches around the country, mostly large evangelical megachurches, and adapted those strategies to a Lutheran context. They hired consultants. They ran focus groups. They tracked metrics attendance, small group participation, volunteer engagement, giving, and it worked. From 30 people in 1997, they grew to 500 by 2005, to 1,200 by 2015, to over 2,000 today. They've planted 3 daughter churches. They're adding a 4th service because they're out of room. By every measurable metric, Resurrection is a phenomenal success. But here's where things get complicated, because success at growth doesn't necessarily mean success at everything else. I spent time interviewing members of both congregations, asking them about their faith, their understanding of Lutheran theology, their spiritual lives. And something fascinating emerged. At Faith Memorial, despite the tiny congregation and the general atmosphere of decline, people demonstrated a remarkable depth of theological knowledge. They could articulate Lutheran distinctives, the difference between justification and sanctification, the theology of the cross versus the theology of glory, the nature of the sacraments. They'd read Luther. They understood church history. Their faith, whatever else you could say about it, was intellectually grounded. At Resurrection, the pattern was different. People were enthusiastic, committed, involved. They attended regularly, participated in small groups, volunteered, gave generously. But when I asked theological questions, the answers were often thin. The focus was on personal experience, on what God was doing in their life, on the practical application of biblical principles. When I asked about Lutheran distinctives, most couldn't articulate them. Several people didn't even know what made Lutheranism different from other Protestant traditions. In one memorable conversation, a young woman who'd been attending Resurrection for 5 years told me enthusiastically about how the church had changed her life. She'd found community, overcome anxiety, strengthened her marriage. Then I asked her what Lutheran theology meant to her. She paused. "I guess I'm not really sure," she said. "I mean, Pastor Ryan is Lutheran, so I guess we're learning Lutheran stuff, but honestly, I just think of it as Bible-based Christianity." So here's the tension. Faith Memorial has theological depth but no people. Resurrection has people but questionable theological depth. Faith Memorial is dying as a faithful remnant. Resurrection is thriving as something that might not quite be what it claims to be. Which one is succeeding? Which one is failing? The answer depends entirely on what you think the purpose of a church is. If you believe the church's primary purpose is to preserve and transmit a specific theological tradition, to maintain doctrinal purity, to serve as a guardian of orthodoxy, then Faith Memorial is doing exactly what it should. The fact that it's small and aging doesn't necessarily mean it's failing. It might mean it's a faithful minority in an unfaithful age. But if you believe the church's primary purpose is to reach new people, to create communities of faith that actually impact people's lives, to grow and multiply and spread the gospel, then Resurrection is clearly succeeding where Faith Memorial is failing. The problem, of course, is that both of these are legitimate purposes. The church is called to both preserve truth and reach the lost. Both maintain theological integrity and communicate effectively with contemporary culture. Both think deeply and act practically. The tension between these two imperatives has existed throughout Christian history. You see it in the early church's debates about how much to accommodate Greco-Roman culture. You see it in the Reformation's tension between doctrinal precision and pastoral care. You see it in every generation's struggle between tradition and innovation. But something about our current cultural moment has intensified this tension to a breaking point. Because the gap between what Faith Memorial represents and what Resurrection represents isn't just a matter of style or preference. It's a gap in fundamental assumptions about what Christianity is and how it functions in the world. Let me give you a concrete example. Both churches teach the Lutheran doctrine of justification by faith alone, the idea that we're saved by God's grace through faith, not by our own works. This is supposed to be the central, non-negotiable Lutheran distinctive. At Faith Memorial, Pastor Margaret preaches about justification using the theological framework developed over centuries of Lutheran scholarship. She references the formula of Concord, explains the nuances of forensic justification, distinguishes between the alien righteousness of Christ and the actual renewal of the believer. Her sermons on this topic are masterclasses in systematic theology. At Resurrection, Pastor Ryan also preaches about justification by faith. But he does it by telling stories about people who were trying to earn God's approval through religious performance, who were exhausted and anxious and never felt good enough until they finally understood that God loves them not because of what they do, but because of who Jesus is and what Jesus did. Same doctrine, completely different communication. One is academically precise but inaccessible to most people. The other is emotionally resonant but theologically imprecise. Which approach is right? Both? Neither? It depends on whether you prioritize precision or connection, depth or breadth, the few who understand or the many who need to hear. And this gets at something even deeper, because what's happening to these two churches isn't unique to Lutheranism or even to Christianity. It's happening across institutions in American society. Think about higher education. You have elite universities that maintain rigorous academic standards, that refuse to compromise intellectual integrity, that produce world-class scholarship. But they're increasingly expensive, increasingly isolated from the broader population, increasingly irrelevant to the lives of average people. Meanwhile, you have for-profit colleges and online education platforms that are accessible, affordable, and practical, but often of questionable academic quality. Think about journalism. You have prestigious outlets like the New York Times and The Atlantic that do in-depth, carefully researched reporting. But they're behind paywalls and written at a level that assumes significant background knowledge. Meanwhile, you have social media and YouTube channels that reach millions but often sacrifice accuracy for engagement. Think about art. You have galleries and museums that preserve and present work of genuine aesthetic and cultural value. But most people never visit them. Meanwhile, you have mass entertainment that everyone consumes but that often lacks depth or lasting significance. The same tension: depth versus accessibility, quality versus reach, the elite few versus the masses. And in each case, our society is fracturing along these lines. We're creating parallel institutions that serve different populations and can barely communicate with each other. That's what's happened to Faith Memorial and Resurrection. They're not just different churches, they're different worlds, operating on different premises, speaking different languages, pursuing different visions of what Christianity should be. And here's what makes this story particularly poignant. Both churches think they're doing the right thing. Both have compelling arguments for their approach. Both are sincere in their faith and their commitment. Pastor Margaret at Faith Memorial isn't an out-of-touch elitist who doesn't care about people. She's a dedicated pastor who believes that the deepest love she can show people is to take their minds seriously, to refuse to talk down to them, to offer them the richest resources of the Christian intellectual tradition. She believes that dumbing things down is actually a form of contempt, that people deserve better than simplistic slogans and emotional manipulation. Pastor Ryan at Resurrection isn't a theological lightweight who's selling out for numbers. He's a committed Christian who believes that if the gospel isn't accessible to ordinary people, then it's not really good news. He believes that the church has often used theological jargon and cultural barriers to exclude people that Jesus would have welcomed. He thinks meeting people where they are is exactly what Jesus did. They're both right, and they're both wrong, or maybe more accurately, they're both incomplete. Because the Christian tradition at its best has always held together what Faith Memorial and Resurrection have pulled apart. The great theologians were also great communicators. Augustine wrote sophisticated philosophy and simple sermons. Luther produced both The Bondage of the Will, an incredibly dense theological treatise, and the Small Catechism, designed to be understood by children. C.S. Lewis wrote academic literary criticism and also children's stories that made theology accessible to millions.